Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars. It's the only thing that's been even more inescapable than Christmas itself this holiday season. So for once, I'm actually going to follow the pack and do what every other critic is doing this time of year, and give my thoughts on the new Star Wars movie. Though as is traditional with speaking about most sequels to some sort of franchise, I probably have to give my opinions on the old films as well. At least I think that's what you're supposed to do. I think that most people here probably just want to know what my opinion on the new one is, but this is my show and this is how we're doing it. So this is Headphones UK Star Wars-athon. So yeah, today I'm going to be going over some brief overviews of what I thought of all the Star Wars movies from 1 to 6, and then I'm going to be giving some detailed analysis on what I thought of the new movie. Now, obviously, no need to say it, spoiler alert for the older movies. When I get to the newer movie, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers as much as I can, or even just speaking in detail about some things, but there are going to be some things, nothing major, but just some occasional minor bits that I might reveal, so just be aware of that. If you haven't seen the movie and you want to be going in completely blind, I wouldn't recommend going that far. Just a heads up, by the way, this is going to be more of a vlog than it is going to be a proper review. There will be some rehearsed and scripted content, but I'm mostly just going off of the top of my head here. And I also just want to point out that I do have a cold, not a massive one, so I might sound like I've got a bit of a blocked nose or a bit of a croaky throat. I'll try and get that out of the way as much as I can, but I can't promise that I won't start sounding like this at some points. But yeah, and also just as always, this is just my opinion. I'm not saying as any of this is fact. If you have a disagreement about what I'm saying, then that's perfectly fine, and I encourage you to post your own thoughts in the comment section below. There's admittedly some opinions that many people won't agree with, but there might also be some that people will agree with. This is an area of the world where not only within criticism but also in movies people are very opinionated on. I know that for certain, and I knew that going into this. But just saying that what I say here is just what I think, and you can feel free to post what you think below. So, first things first, of course, Phantom Menace. This is a movie that many critic either dreads or is completely enthralled when talking about. I feel that my opinions might be a tad different from everybody else's. Actually, Phantom Menace was the very first Star Wars movie I ever watched, and for anybody who's grown up in England, you'll know that ITV shows pretty much the exact same 4 movie franchises continuously every time of year. That being either Star Wars, Back to the Future, James Bond, or something else I can't remember, but I'm sure that I'll be able to put it up here somewhere. But anyway, so that means that eventually when Phantom Menace came on TV when I was about 9 or 8 years old, I naturally saw it. And even in that young, impressionable age and having no exposure to Star Wars even prior to that, I really didn't have that much interest in it. The movie, just to me, felt kind of dull. It's like, I was back in that age where obviously cartoons and very upbeat kids shows were everything to me. So naturally, watching something I thought was a bit more adult and grown up, I thought would have been a tad dull. But even seeing something as amazing of what could have been, Phantom Menace just didn't grab me at all, though that might have been just a mix between my mentality or the fact that the movie isn't that good. I'll fully admit that, it really isn't that good. The movie did at the very least have some promise in that there are some good action scenes, those that aren't being bogged down by the incredibly dated CGI, that is. But at the same time, there's really not a whole lot to talk about the movie these days because everybody's talked about it to death. But yeah, so Qui-Gon Jinn, kinda useless apart from the fact that he's played by Liam Neeson, which is a little bit cool. Young Obi-Wan Kenobi is okay, but he gets better as the movies go on. Anakin Skywalker, annoying. Padme, boring and annoying. Jar Jar Binks, annoying times 10. Darth Maul is actually probably the most interesting character, not necessarily because he's actually interesting as a character, but just because he's got a really, really good design. He's probably one of the most unique Sith Lords to have come out of the franchise post the original series, because there was a lot of expanded universe material that introduced a lot of funky new lightsabers, but he was the first one to have one that looked genuinely unique in a canon-based franchise. And of course, it's difficult not to like him when he's voiced by
Peter Serafinowicz.
So yeah, Darth Maul, not exactly an interesting character, but at the very least he's something cool to look at. And I will say one thing is that in the movie, it definitely had some promise in the designs. The designs were actually quite good. They were bright, they were vibrant, they were colourful, and they had a look of Star Wars to them. Granted, it's difficult to get into them because the CGI butchers them so badly, but at the very least they look nice to look at as a picture. And of course, as with any Star Wars movie, the music is absolutely phenomenal. In fact, this actually gave me my all-time favourite Star Wars song, that being Duel of Fates. But yeah, so without prattling on for too long for what many others have done, Phantom Menace, not a very entertaining movie. And there may be some bits in there that some people might be able to find enjoyable if they can get past the very tedious, boring, and frankly annoying parts. But yeah, it just didn't quite work out. That being said, however, it's not my least favourite within the Star Wars franchise. That distinction goes to Attack of the Clones. Now, even though I admit that Attack of the Clones is nowhere near as bad as Phantom Menace, I distinctly like this movie even less than Phantom Menace. And the reason for that is quite a simple factor. It's boring as hell. Phantom Menace, while not being a great movie, had some moments in there that were actually quite entertaining and memorable, and even the parts that weren't, they do at the very least give you more of an impression of an emotion than just sitting there waiting for something to happen. Which for me, when I watch Clone Wars, is what happens. I'm just sitting there waiting for something to happen, and even when an action scene does happen, I don't really care, because oh my god, the amount of CGI in this movie. There is so much really dated CGI in this movie. I'm having trouble thinking of a scene that wasn't shot in front of a green screen or had some little cartoon puppet in the background. It is absolutely absurd how much there is in this movie. And to be fair, while the modern day is still very dependent on CGI, this movie is overly dependent on it. And I'm not necessarily complaining out of the lack of practical effects, even though I do love practical effects. I'm complaining out of the grounds that it doesn't look good. The only thing that did look decent was some of the world's designs, because some of the worlds were actually quite well designed, including giving us one of the most unique areas in the Star Wars franchise to date, in that it's one of the few ones where we actually get some in the rain, which we hadn't seen yet. So that's actually quite interesting. But even with that, I just don't like Attack of the Clones. It's dull, monotonous, and even when things do happen, I just don't give a shit about it. Of course, Anakin is first played by Hayden Christensen in the movie, and while I don't hate him as much as other people do, he's admittedly not the best choice, and he really falls down when he has to do the things that his character is known for, that being whining like a crybaby, or spouting horrible romantic nothings at Padme, and yeah, that's probably one of the worst things about the Star Wars prequel, is that the really forced romance. This is probably well known as being one of the worst on-screen romances they've ever seen until Bella and Edward from Twilight. And even then, they're hilarious. Padme and Anakin are just painful to watch. But even with that, Obi-Wan Kenobi being played by Ewan McGregor is brilliant, and you really do kind of see the elements of Alec Guinness's performance when you watch him. Jango Fett is kind of interesting, and you can't go wrong with Count Dooku just because of the fact that he's played by Christopher Lee. But yeah, as I say, Attack of the Clones I really don't like. it's boring and it's difficult to get through, but some of the designs of the worlds are just kind of decent, and there's one or two characters you might like. Oh, and of course, Mace Windu, he's also great as well, so you really can't go wrong with Samuel L. Jackson. But yeah, so my least favourite of the main Star Wars movies thus far. I don't know what's there left to come, because I know there are still 2 more sequels to go, but at the moment, my least favourite. So as we now formally move on to the last of the prequels, we now go on to Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And in all honesty, I actually kind of like this movie a lot more than the other prequels. There are still some curious bits to get through, like obviously Anakin and Padme, that's still kind of rubbish. And while the CGI has gotten a little better by this point, it's still really dated and a big over-reliance on it. But there are some really good action scenes in this. There's a lot of drama, a lot of really dark elements. Obviously, you still get a lot of characters that you really enjoy, including the formal return of the Emperor. And I know he was in the other movies, but this is the true time when he actually feels like the Emperor. And of all the prequels, this feels like it actually had a story that needed to be told within the lineage of the franchise. All the other ones just kind of felt like they were either fan fiction or expanded universe material that got beefed up into a theatrical release. This movie actually did feel like it was part of the Star Wars lineage and actually needed to be told to be understood. So that's pretty good. But yeah, this one's going to be not the most beloved of the franchise, I know that for certain, and while admittedly it's not my favourite and there's definitely a lot of stuff to get through you're not going to like, I do think it was actually quite enjoyable for what it could have been, and it could have been a lot worse. But yeah, so not the best, but it's better than the other ones. But now we move on to the greatest film in the Star Wars franchise, the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Introducing Chewbacca's family, his wife Mala, his father Itchy.
Nah, I'm just kidding. It's Return of the Ewok.
But I am an Ewok!
You don't look like an Ewok.
I'm in disguise to avoid quarantine!
No, of course, we move on to Episode 4, which is still to this day my favourite Star Wars movie. The way I was exposed to this was the way I was exposed to all of the original trilogy the first time. Now, like I said, I watched Phantom Menace first. I didn't watch Clone Wars or Revenge of the Sith until after I'd seen the original trilogy. But what I can really attribute to getting me into Star Wars in the first place was the LEGO Star Wars video games. I played the first one when I was younger and I absolutely adored it, which also started my love of the LEGO games, but that's another story. And then when I eventually not only played the second one, but also got my first home console, that being a PS2 at the same time, I also started to become intrigued about the actual stories themselves. And so eventually I borrowed my uncle's VHS copies. I should point out that these were the special editions that were re-released in 1997, I believe. So admittedly it's not the best exposure, but it's better than nothing. And from there I was completely hooked and I absolutely adored them. But yeah, like I said, Star Wars Episode 4 is still really my favourite of all the Star Wars movies. It has a distinct feel of an old Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon serial from the 1950s, and that's definitely what they were going for. The cinematography is outstanding even for the time it was made. The characters are really enjoyable, though you can argue that compared to some characters in storytelling today they're a little bit bland, but I still think they work, and obviously they do develop as they go along. The action, of course, is phenomenal. The effects are great. There's just a lot of good stuff to get through. It's just really enjoyable. It leaves you with a good feeling all throughout, and despite the drama, you do really get invested in it. And obviously you get some amazing villainy in the Empire, which to this day is still probably one of the best depictions of neo-Nazis that you ever get in film. Yes, I just said neo-Nazis. Come on, we all know it. They're Nazis. They're as much as Nazis as Death Eaters are. But yeah, so Episode 4 is still to this day my favourite, and while there are admittedly some parts that, in compared to how darker the sequels get, it can get a little bit tedious, and admittedly there are some parts where they add in a little bit unnecessary comic relief, it is still very enjoyable and I highly recommend it. I still consider to this day Episode 4 to be a movie that everybody in the world who can have the ability to watch it should watch, and while you're at it, you might as well go and check out Episode 5 at the same time. Episode 5, while being a great movie, is probably my least favourite, but that's not saying that it's bad, it's just the one that I probably have watched the least for very personal reasons. It does get appropriately darker, I do like that. I do like how it does get darker compared to the first movie, and the events that transpire through the movie can get interesting, but there are times when it feels like the movie does drag. But that being said, we do get introduced to another great character of Lando Calrissian, and in my personal opinion, the cinematography and set design is the best of the entire Star Wars franchise within this movie. And it's arguably probably the most iconic of all the Star Wars movies. The Hoth scene has been recreated several times in other media, particularly video games, and of course the famous "I am your father" line, spoilers again, apologies for that, is arguably the most famous thing about Star Wars ever made, and this is arguably the movie that within the Star Wars franchise that permanently put it on the pedestal of being one of the greatest franchises of all time. But yeah, so even though this is probably my least favourite and there are definitely some parts that I don't like, it is still a fantastic movie and I can definitely see why for most people it's their favourite of the Star Wars films. So we move on to Episode 6, and while my thoughts about the previous movie might be a bit controversial, I know that if I don't tread lightly I might just start a flame war with this one. I'm just going to start right away with this, that Episode 6 was actually the first of the franchise I ever saw. When playing the Lego Star Wars video games, I was actually the most intrigued by the way that Episode 6 looked. So when I got those VHS tapes, I plopped in Episode 6 straight away. So like many people, because I found that a lot of people have actually seen this one as their first one of the original trilogy, this was my first exposure to the movie. So from that, I do definitely have a lot of sentiment about it. But even with that, I can admit that this movie did fall down in comparison to the first two. And yeah, if I thought that the last movie dragged, the first half hour of this movie is nearly completely pointless. They have to rescue Han, yes, but it goes on for a bit too long than it should do. No, don't get me wrong, there definitely is some enjoyment out of it, and it's the first time we get to see Jabba the Hutt. That is within the original continuity. I know that the special editions, you see him in his horrible CGI glory, or if you're watching the original unreleased footage in all his Henry VIII looking glory. But there are still some interesting moments and probably some of the most unique character designs since the Mos Eisley scene from Episode 4. But yeah, after that part, which can be a little bit monotonous but is still very enjoyable, we finally get into the movie proper, and compared to some people's opinions, that's where it either gets worse or it gets great. Because obviously we have the Ewoks. Now I do want to point out that there were some elements of commercialization and simplifying character designs prior, because obviously we had Admiral Big Mouth Billy Bass.
And now I'm back on the flack. Don't look surprised that I'm still singing, cause you know I have the knack.
But the Ewoks are definitely something that is very split for some people. Personally, I have nothing against the Ewoks. Jar Jar Binks has proved that there are worse things that can come out of the Star Wars franchise that are both an element just to create some comic relief and be a marketing ploy for kids. But with the Ewoks, I never really had a problem with it. And as the Cinema Snob once said, they were going to eat Han and Luke. I'm not fucking with them. But yeah, so I can understand why people don't like the Ewoks. They are a little bit of a distraction from where the main element of the story is supposed to be, and they were definitely made as a commercialization element, and if people don't believe that, cartoon based off the Ewoks and 2 TV movies. They were meant to sell toys, for crying out loud. But at the same time, I don't really mind the Ewoks, and you kind of have to be honest, they did kind of help save the day in the end. But even with that, it does get, again, appropriately darker, and some of the drama between the characters, which you kind of expected to come out after the big reveal at the end of the last movie, does feel genuine, though sometimes Han's jealousy of Luke does come off as a little bit forced, and there are a lot of moments where it seems like that plot point just completely disappears. But even so, this is still a very beloved element of the franchise for me, and while I can understand why some people don't like it, I do enjoy it quite a bit, and I'll always come back to this movie.